And so, but again, my name's Ed Stetzer. I have the privilege of serving here at the Billy Graham Center Wheaton College. And some of you are familiar with what we do with the New Churches podcast, the Send Institute, other things. Here, we're excited to be partnering with, specifically with Exponential. And we're here, we're launching a webinar. We're going to do a series of webinars. And in these webinars, we're going to talk about what's going on. We're going to talk to specific leaders. Today, we're going to have the amazing Larry Osborne. We're going to talk about specific leaders. We're going to be using the chat feature to allow you to interact as well. You'll be able to submit questions to Larry. I'll see them. I'll ask those questions. And let me remind you that you use the chat feature to submit your questions here in Zoom. So again, depending on what you're logged in, we can't get the Facebook Live questions, but we can get the Zoom questions. So if you're using Zoom, you can send some questions there as well. And don't wait for the Q&A time. If you go ahead and submit those now, we can get started with those questions as we go. So I want to encourage you to follow along with us, and we'll be able to hear these questions and be able to share these questions. So don't be afraid to do those things. We've heard from Todd Wilson, who is the brain behind Exponential, and he says it's working. He used 3 exclamation points. When an engineer like Todd uses 3 exclamation points, that means we're having a good time. So again, if you're watching the Exponential website, below the window, there's a viewer. If you have the Exponential site that says open chat window, and then you can dialogue with others as well. Okay, so the Exponential Conference, of course, is the theme of Exponential this year is Hero Maker. We're going to watch a video and listen to Dave Ferguson, who, by the way, is also in the Chicagoland area. So now that's great. We like that. So let's have Brooks roll Dave's quick opener, and then we'll discuss with Larry about hero making.
I want to say thanks for joining me. I want to give a special invitation to you and all the leaders that surround you to Exponential 2018, where our theme is going to be Hero Maker. I think of all the themes we've had over the years, we've been doing this, it's going to be our 11th year. This is probably the one I am the most excited about. And part of the reason you want to come to Exponential is this is a community of people. It's not really a conference, it's a community of people with a cause. And I'll tell you what, if you're a church planter leader, if you ever thought about church planting, I'm telling you, when you show up, it's going to be like, wow, those are my people. I have found my tribe. I love that. And not only do you find your community, but we also will equip you. We'll do great stuff. We have some of the best speakers in the country. They'll be on the main stage, and then just tons and tons of either workshops or equipping labs to make sure that you can do your very, very best work in the Jesus mission and church planting. But I specifically want to invite you to join me for the Hero Maker Equipping Lab that we're doing all across the country. I had the opportunity to write a book with Warren Bird. This came out of some of my own reflection, my own leadership, but also a think tank that we assembled from Exponential. And we asked the question, what kind of a leader, leads a reproducing and multiplying church? And what we came away with is there are like 5 essential practices that this reproducing and multiplying leader, whether it's a volunteer leader or a senior leader of a church, that they do these 5 practices. And in this equipping lab, I want to share those with you. I want to give those to you. I want to give you simple tools that you can actually, if you wanted to, you could apply that afternoon. And how to do those. These practices are things like multiplication thinking. They're things like permission giving. The really key one, disciple multiplying. Something we call gift activating. And then the last one is kingdom building, which gives you a brand new scorecard, which I'm telling you, I needed it, you need this. So if you would, love to have you join me at any of the equipping labs where we're talking about Hero Maker, the 5 essential practices of leaders that multiply leaders. All right? I hope to see you and your team there with me.
You can actually see on the screen there some of the dates and locations. I want to encourage you to notice that. Southern California, October 2nd through the 4th. Actually, Larry will be there as well. So we want you to be aware of those things. Larry, so good to see you, old friend. Larry, when I had a television show, this is like the second coming of my little television show. You were on the television show. This is like from that room, nevertheless. So it's like a reunion. It's good to see you, old friend.
Same here. You didn't have to call me old friend, though. But
well, our friendship is old, but we are just young at heart. And so let me tell everyone a little bit about Larry. Now, Larry is the senior pastor of a small, struggling church there in California. He had grown from 128 to over 12,000 on weekend services. He recognized one of the most innovative churches in the country, pioneered areas and around multi-site video venues, sermon-based small groups, one of the leaders of the multi-site movement with over 50 different worship options on 5 local campuses. They're sermon-based small groups, and you may feel like you've heard things like sticky. That's kind of his deal. Is he talks about being sticky all the time, which we'll have him explain in just a little bit. But they actually have over 90% of their average weekend attendance in these small groups. Larry's written Thriving in Babylon, which, Larry, I actually have a new book coming out in September that I actually quote your book. I actually have a whole chapter. We're not in Israel, we're in Babylon. But Accidental Pharisees, which personally convicted me, A Contrarian's Guide. Actually, every one of Larry's books is a contrarian's guide to something, to knowing God, things. And I could go on and on from there. So this week's topic is kingdom building, and one of the 5 essential practices. Remember what Dave talked about: multiplication thinking, permission giving, disciple, multiplying, gift activating, and kingdom building as well. So kingdom building is a shift. And one of the things I want to talk about is how Larry does even multi-site. Instead of counting people who show up at my thing, you count leaders you send out to do God's thing. And so we're going to talk about some of those things. Talking about being a hero maker. Larry, to you first, let's start asking you, who are you? Who are your hero makers? Who really helped you to kind of understand what it means to look focused on the ways of Jesus, to focus on his kingdom work? Who are some people that spoke into your life?
Sure. Well, it'd go all the way back to my dad, who was a principal, and mom, both of which decided that pouring into their kids and helping them be all they could be without any sense of pushing, any sense of their goals, just like, we're here for you. We're going to sublimate all that we could be. My dad could have been a superintendent of schools, chose to be an elementary school principal, simply so he could be home more nights, even though a little less pay, a little less prestige, as say a high school principal, and certainly superintendent when he interviewed for those jobs. So it started there. And then early mentors I had just very much had a Barnabas spirit. I didn't know there was anything but that. I had a youth pastor who I've had the privilege of working with now as our executive pastor at North Coast for many years. He was a few years older than me and let me start teaching right away as a youngster, because I had a stronger teaching gift than he did, which was pretty amazing to do with a 17, 18-year-old new Christian. And then my main mentor, a guy in my tribe called Wally Norling, who was a church planter extraordinaire, again, did the same thing. He was a guy who just relished seeing God's fruit grow on other people's trees. And so, frankly, I was in ministry a few years before I realized, everybody doesn't think that way. So yeah. I feel like I started on third base when it comes to this.
I love that. And you've often talked in our conversations about the healthy environment you grew up in. You talk sometimes about pastors having a father wound. You've talked about people being concerned about their identity as building something significant. One of the things that Dave writes in his book, Hero Maker, is the practice of kingdom building is a shift from counting the people who show up at my thing to counting the leaders who go out and do God's thing. Kingdom building requires we reject the old ways of measuring success, use simple tools like a scorecard that measures the number of current disciple makers and total disciple makers. So you've got a fascinating journey of counting, even to the point where you talk about multi-site. I remember you just so casual. Yeah, we got people that take our videos. I don't even know what they're doing. They're churches and are part of their multi-sites of North Coast that you don't even know who they are. So I want you to tell me, I'm going to sit back and I'm going to take my tea and I'm going to soak in some Larry wisdom about how you think in terms of being a kingdom-minded hero maker. Talk to us. And take a few minutes to unpack this. And we'll remind everyone, put your questions. You're at the Exponential site, the little chat box. You can go there and submit those questions. But Larry, tell us, because I think it's an important part of your ministry.
Well, I think everybody is kingdom-minded as long as it's overseas and more than 30 minutes away. That for me is where things break down. And because of that, we often even restrict ourselves when it comes to being a hero maker and kingdom-minded and releasing people. Because one of the things I've noticed today is everybody wants to start a movement, but the good and bad about the movements is the fruit that they produce. Awesome. The bad about it is some people think that they can't be a kingdom person if they don't have their own movement with their own brand and their own tattoo on everything that comes out of their church. I don't think you change the world without intentionally having leadership pipelines, having things that spring up and become movements. I'm a huge fan of that. Personally, I'm more of a leadership machine. That's where I focus. We were over 3,000 before anybody on our staff wasn't homegrown. But one of the things over time that I began to realize is I was really excited about movements as long as it was my movement.
Mm.
Okay. And I was excited about growth as long as it was, like I said, overseas or another church in my tribe more than 30 minutes away. And one of the processes that I found myself going through was trying to struggle with what does it really mean to be a Barnabas, who's always been my New Testament hero, who at the beginning it's Barnabas and Saul and Barnabas and Paul, and then he seems to not care much when it becomes Paul and Barnabas, which in that culture is a very significant thing. In the Greek language and the culture, the order that names were listed in, he's always was, at the top and Saul down at the bottom. And so I really began to ask myself a lot of questions about that. What if it's not about me? So that goes back when we were a couple hundred people. The decision that, can I share the platform? Because I saw a lot of people raising up other pastors, but then for that other pastor to really fly high, they had to go somewhere else. There wasn't ever enough room in the cage for two kings or tigers on a hill. So as I've watched the Spirit of God work in the Church Universal and the Church in America, I've been very pleased and many times very informed by things I kind of understood as it were in the shadows. And then I would see somebody do that value in a different way. And I go, oh, okay, I hadn't seen that opportunity for it. But a lot of it just goes way, way back to a Barnabas spirit, because if you don't have a Barnabas spirit, you eventually won't have a kingdom spirit. I like to say everybody wants to be Barnabas until David shows up, and then suddenly they're King Saul.
That's good. So it is very unusual to, and maybe a testament to the need for this, to see the switch like that. I can't remember. I mean, I don't know that I can think of any examples where there was a senior pastor who identified that maybe there was another person with greater gifts. No, I just thought of one. So, but in all of my years of ministry. So, I mean, how would you advise? I mean, maybe the question is, have you advised people, help this person be the hero of this, or help this person be a greater communicator here? Have you advised people on that journey, and how do people respond?
Yeah, well, part of it is I believe if you don't have that spirit in your church, you're never going to have that spirit towards the kingdom. So it's got to start at home. It's just like you want a lot of branches bearing a lot of fruit. You better first of all have a decent trunk, or the branches are going to fall off. It can't be all about the trunk.
Yeah.
So I kind of look at the early days, and people, because of the size of our church and being known a little bit, don't realize that first 3 years of North Coast, we grew by one person, and it took 5 years until I was large enough to be able to add even another staff member. So I know what it's like to wonder if it will ever grow, and what will happen and what kind of impact you'll have outside of your neighborhood. And I think what happens is we all feel a little vulnerable. If you think of a Russian nesting doll, they're kind of cool, but if you take one of them by themselves, they're made of that.
I just say that that's not a normal sentence. Can you think about Russian nesting doll? But okay, just keep going with it. I just want to point out that I don't think about those things. But go ahead.
Okay, but think about it with me for a moment, if you would. But if you pull anyone aside, it's made out of very light wood, and it can just be crushed. And I think in a ministry, from the natural and appropriate insecurities, fears, and all that, we realize we need to get stronger. So what most of us do is we get smaller dolls, and they stuff inside. And every time you stuff one inside, you get stronger and stronger, more unbreakable. And you feel like, man, we've got some momentum here. But if you really want to advance the kingdom, you've got to start adding bigger dolls. And you will end up just as strong in terms of being unbreakable. But what happens is you won't get all the glory. You won't get the fame. Somebody else will be up there. And I believe it just starts with if the Lord gives you enough of a church that you can have staff people, key lay leaders, and volunteers, that you look for people who aren't just helpers, but are in their own way big L leaders in areas that they're going to outshine you. And that's how the church grows. And as the church grows, now you have the ability to do that with the kingdom as well.
Yeah.
So from there, it just spreads out.
So I'm Ed Stetzer. This is the Exponential webinar, and Larry Osborne's our guest, good friend of many years. Larry's actually going to be speaking at the Southern California Exponential Conference, and that's coming up October 2 through 4, if I recall. And we'll want to encourage you to be engaged and involved in that. Larry, what are you going to talk about there at the Exponential Conference? I know the theme's hero making. What's your talk going to be about?
I'm going to talk a lot about what it means to have your fruit grow on other people's trees and the various ways we can do it. You know, one of the cool things that Dave and Todd have wanted to see is the needle move as far as reproducing, multiplying churches from 4% to 10%, which is awesome. But at the end of the day, that means there's still going to be 90%. Are they just going to pull in and say, okay, well, I'm not part of the 10%? Or are there ways to advance the kingdom without having your own pipeline, without having your own movement? And I believe there are. And it starts with a change of heart that everybody has to have, from the movement leader as a movement everybody knows about, to the neighborhood person who's seen their fruit grow on someone else's tree and no one even knows their tag is on it. I think of the church I grew up in. It gets no credit for Larry Osborne because it didn't intentionally sit me out. Though it did lead me to Jesus, it did disciple me and gave me a hunger, but they didn't tattoo me. So no one knows Whittier Hills Baptist Church. It gets zero credit. And I want to help those kind of churches understand you can have a kingdom impact that's huge as well.
I love that. I love that. By the way, I look back to Bishop Greg Brewer, who's now the bishop for the Episcopal Diocese of Central Florida. He discipled me as a teenager, just had recently come to Christ in the charismatic movement of the Episcopal Church. And I'm deeply thankful for so many people that went out of that little church. It's called Church of the New Covenant. Now he's the bishop of the diocese. So many people, this wonderful evangelical, Episcopal, charismatic church who went out to ministry. So again, he was a hero. I think of people that you might even know some of their names who've gone out and done significant things as well. Let me remind everyone that we are using the chat feature. Follow along with the webinar. We want this to be a discussion. We've got several questions. I'm going to go right to the questions, Larry, in just a minute. I'll do that. I think you see them as well. So I'm going to go to Les's question in just a second. But let me remind people, if you're watching the Exponential website, which is where we encourage you to for the best question answering, below the window you're viewing is a button that says Open Chat Window, and you can use the chat feature to dialogue with others as well as submit questions. You can actually talk to other people as well. The Exponential team is in the chat room with you, and they'll be taking those questions and feeding them over to Larry and me. So Les has a question. He says, shouldn't the primary goal, I love questions like this because it's kind of like, this is Les's opinion, but I want you to comment on it. Shouldn't the primary goal be devoted to disciple making? Yes. But anyway, that's a very different proposition from church multiplication. It's much more time, labor, and resource intensive than just opening a new church. So I think he's kind of right, but how do these things relate? Because you got a real passion for disciple making.
Well, I think what has happened is we've actually confused some of it because everybody's a bit of a gift projector. So we look at our own gifts and our own calling. We think everybody else will have those gifts and calling when they grow up, or they should. And there are numerous things we preach but don't believe, and one is the body of Christ. We proclaim it, but we really think everybody, when they fully submit to Jesus, will be like we are. And so what has happened is leaders, because we have the platform, we often have taken the two rails that the church local and church universal need to run on. And they are the rail of discipleship, which is about becoming more obedient and more like Jesus, and it's for everybody. And leadership development, which is for some and has more of a focus on sacrifice, not that obedience doesn't. And we've turned them into a monorail. And I think that's where that question comes out, is that we see there's a battle between discipleship and leadership. No, they are two rails, and the train was never designed to be a monorail. And in fact, when discipleship ends up where leadership is the top rung of being a disciple and vocational ministry is standing on the top ledge, what you end up is arrogant leaders who look down on everyone else who doesn't have a leadership gifts. And you end up with despairing disciples who try to lead even though they don't have a gift towards that at all. Anybody who's ever gone to Bible school or seminary has seen people in their class, and 5 minutes into it, this guy or this gal has no future as a leader, but they're spending all kinds of time and money because they think that's the epitome of becoming Jesus-like in character. So I just see you have to spend equal effort on both. In my personal journey, early on, it was all about leadership because of that gift projection. For me, the later thing was to realize, some people have gifts of helps and mercy. And they're great Christians, and I need to help them become better at that, though they will never lead anything. and that leaders can't lead without sustainers and helpers and background and all kinds of other things. So I see it as a both and, not having to make a distinction. So if I focus just on discipleship, I have no future.
Right.
If I focus just on leadership, I have no salt and light. We're just spinning so fast, nothing's happening.
It's good. So how do you assess you talked about how early on in your ministry was all about leadership, but later it became more about other things. How do you have that honest and accurately assessing how you're doing in kingdom ministry, kingdom leadership?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. The number one measurement of organizational health is retention. Now, that doesn't mean you're spiritually healthy or whatever, but I grew up in some ministries and was part of some early movements that spread across the country. And what I saw is a lot of zeal, but not much retention. So for me, I went back to on disciples. Well, let me just start with people deciding to become a Jesus follower. I became less and less satisfied with nods to God and more determined to say, how can we have retention? So though we count first-time decisions here at North Coast Church, we don't broadcast them. But we track those first-time decisions for Jesus at 12 months, 18 months, and 3 years. And I remember the last time I spoke at a main stage Exponential in Florida, I went in right before the meeting and I asked our person who has the data, I said, pull it up. And it was 74% of adult decisions from 3 years ago were still connected in some way.
Wow.
So I think that's important. And then the next thing I look for in terms of kingdom is are we releasing people? Or are we feeling like we have to hold them? And again, for me, it really starts with the next door because it's so easy to do it overseas and 30 minutes away. So one of the things I started and keep score with is I do some mentoring of church planters in northern San Diego. In fact, we helped one plant a church literally across the street, and it actually has my own tribe and across the street.
Yeah.
And so for us, I go, show me the fruit. Who are the people that you can identify that's either a church you planted or a church that would say, you know what, you helped us expand and make a big difference. Personally, I've never felt a call, and again, this is description, not prescription. I've never felt a call to have my own pipeline. I've felt a call to be a resource to tons of pipelines.
It's a good word. It's a good word. Let me remind you that you can submit questions. As a matter of fact, your last answer, Larry, is going to lead right into Kay's question. But let me remind you can submit questions. If you're watching in the Exponential site, we'd encourage you to do so. You can get all the information about all the different regional meetings. For example, Larry will be October 2 through 4 at the Southern California Exponential Conference. But Kay asked the question, do you have any wisdom how to lead people in your local church to change that mindset, has to be overseas or 30 minutes away, to multiply locally? Before you answer that question, let me remind you, if you're watching on Facebook Live, take a moment, like and share. This is a free resource provided by Exponential. We want all the people to find it, and as you liking and sharing it right now, take a moment. It will enable other people to find this resource on Facebook later. If you're not watching on Facebook, obviously you can't do that. So to Kay's question, how do you help people change that mindset to multiply locally? You literally planted an E-free church, evangelical free, that's Larry's tribe, so close to you. How do you get that mindset in a church?
I don't want to be clear. We didn't plant it across the street. It was a church of 600 that we helped find a place across the street.
I got you. Wonderful. Okay, good. So talk to me about how you have that. How do you help your church to think, and not just your church, but churches to think locally like that rather than 30 minutes away or overseas?
Well, I think you begin by identifying churches around that are very close, and you just start helping them in tangible ways. This all began for me when we were somewhere around 2,500, 3,000. I realized we'd got addicted to growth. We were measuring God's favor by our growth. There's never been a church that's grown forever or a movement that's continued, forever with its particular title and brand particularly, without morphing and changing. And so at some point, we're going to wake up one year and that's not there. And we need to rejoice in what God did and then look for the wildfires that he's lighting and pour some gasoline on them instead of become a holy huddle protecting our assets. And what I realized, it's almost like tithing. If you don't start young, it's going to be hard later. And so when I'm working with church planners, I tell them somewhere within the first year or two, why don't you find another church near you, another church plant that's, say, within 5, 10, 15 minutes, and why don't you bless them with a check for helping them get something they need. There's not a church plant or a small church or even a declining church that doesn't have need of something that would help them move forward. Why can't you come along and bless them? So I went to our board, talked to them about my concerns in this, and one of the first things we did is we found a little storefront church that had an inordinate youth ministry. My youth guys were telling me about it, and like, wow, they're hitting it out of the park. So we called up that pastor and said, we'd like to give you, I think it was $6,000. Well, why? Well, because you've got this great youth pastor, and we know he'd do even better with an intern. And he looks at us and he goes, we're like a mile and a half apart. We're not a part of your tribe. What? And to me, that's the point.
Love it.
We're just an elective Sunday school class in God's great church in northern San Diego. We happen to be big, but we need to be excited about the growth of the church, not the growth of our church. And where your time, money, and energy goes is where your heart is going to follow. So that's my very practical advice to any church. You don't do it from the pulpit. You do it by behavior. You don't change corporate culture by talking. You change corporate culture by doing differently. And I haven't found a church plant that can't do those kind of things. A church that can't say to any church plant, until we were like 24/7 our place, we'd let any church plant use our facility. Mm-hmm. Hey, you want your planning meetings? You want? Sure, go ahead and use it anytime. Now we can't anymore because we have services and things going all the time, but we can come alongside and do other things.
Love it. I think for a lot of people, that's not a natural inclination. And it's not that they're trying to be sinful. They just don't think that way. And so some of that shift, we've actually started at Moody Church, where I serve as interim. We're now praying by name for local churches that are not ours. Someone asked me, why are you praying for competing churches? I said, there are no churches that are preaching the gospel that are competing with us. It wasn't a person at Moody Church, by the way, who said that. But I do think, and even like, for us, we're hosting, they have these catalyst communities that they do at the New Thing Network. Well, now they're meeting at Moody Church. But even though we don't think that way, the connection is there and is essential. So we're on the same team. Acting that way is a good thing. You want to add something, Larry? Go ahead.
What I want to add to that is all we offer, our heart, I think, is pulled towards obedience when we're doing our best to walk with Jesus. We've all got our sin nature and stuff, but so we have the sin nature that pulls us away, but there's something the Spirit's always doing that is pulling us towards Him. But sometimes we just need models. And I feel like that's one reason I talk about what I just did in terms of what we do. Not to say, hey, look at us and what we did, but to say you can run a 4-minute mile. The old story, once one was run, a bunch were run.
Yep.
And for many of us, we just need one. Okay, we could give $1,000 check. All kinds of churches could just say, every time there's a building program, we want to call that church and find something we can do.
I love
it. It will change the climate. It also will change the way the other churches look at you, I guarantee you.
Love it. This is the kind of thinking you'll hear. Brooks, I want you to put up the list of those Exponential regionals again. This is the kind of thinking that you will hear at these Exponential conferences that are taking place all in and around the country. You can see the dates there coming up very soon. Washington, D.C., different places, different locations. So I want to encourage you to get engaged and involved. Larry's speaking specifically in Southern California. Good, we're going to go back to our questions. By the way, Les would like to clarify. Les, I think you didn't need to clarify, but I'm happy to clarify. I didn't mean that discipleship and leadership are mutually exclusive. To me, discipleship done right will lead to leaders in all of the other roles. And I think Larry and I would agree with you. Let's go on to Nick's question. Let me remind you again, if you're watching at the Exponential site, you can click the button that says open chat window. If you're on Facebook Live, though, we can't actually see those, but still like and share. You can discuss in the Facebook Live comment section. Let me encourage you again, like and share at Facebook Live so we can have this free resource, Larry's wisdom, going to others. So Nick asked the question, what are a few early and easy victories to pursue as you move toward a pipeline of leadership development and leadership restructuring?
The way I look at, I'm often asked, how do you identify leaders? And I tell people it's not that hard because they raise their hand and say, can I do more? And they have fruit. So what I would simply say is the easiest win is look around for people who are doing fairly well in terms of having impact, not just filling a slot, and who are asking you for some of your time to disciple them, asking you for some help, or asking for more to do. It's almost like you're the basketball coach and the gym teacher at a little small town high school. You look for the kids who ask you to teach them how to shoot. And then you say, hey, we're going to put a team together. And then you take those people who say they want to come out for the team and you ask them to do more than you do the PE class. You tell them, you meet me at 6:30, we're running lines. One of the mistakes we make is we try to make the whole PE class do everything everybody on the team does. And once again, then we thin the herd and we get that that leadership arrogance that I talk about. So I just think they self-identify. Some of our problems is we're not really looking for spirit-led leaders. We have a vision of what we want done, and we're trying to jam in enough people into those leadership slots. And sometimes God provides enough. Sometimes it's a little short. At that point, I'm just very organic in my personal approach. Find them and help them.
Find them and help them. I like that. When you were kind of thinking through some of your own church, because one of the things that's interesting, you mentioned that somebody said to you, you're a better communicator, and it went from Barnabas and Saul to Paul and Barnabas. Have you had similar experiences in your own life when you were doing something, somebody could do it better, you stepped away so they could lead or do some of that role? And in other words, have you been on the other side of that equation?
Oh yeah, I'm very good at spreading DNA and leadership around the water cooler. And when the water cooler gets so big that you need strategic meetings, I'm not really good at that. Mm-hmm. And so our exec pastor wasn't just someone to help me administrate the church. It was someone to lead the staff who was far more gifted at creating community in a larger structure. I could do it small and mid-sized incredibly well. But boy, we hit a size and it's not my ball game. Well, there's pain when you platform someone who's really better than you, because guess what? People start going to them instead of you. Everybody goes, oh yeah, I love to make everybody else look better and feel good about themselves. And still you're out on the playground one day and you realize, oh, you weren't first pick anymore. It was the same with some of the preaching. I'm
really not familiar with that concept. I was never first pick in athletic events, but just maybe pick a metaphor that I could relate with next time. But anyway, where keep going?
Yeah, well, the same with preaching. Pretty much anytime you find a big L leader, they're going to have their own fan club, and that's a struggle for anyone to realize, oh, I'm not first pick anymore. I remember one of the very first ones for me was a family I'd helped lead to Jesus and had discipled. And when it came time for them to get discipled, baptized, they wanted one of the other pastors to baptize them. And that felt bad until I got home and I looked in the mirror and I said to myself, Larry, this is everything you've dreamed of. Like, are you kidding me? But I think we're all egotists at heart. We love to be a servant leader as long as everybody knows I'm the leader serving. We don't like it when they think, well, you're just a servant.
I love it. Good. We're getting some good questions coming in, so I'll jump onto those. Again, to remind you, this is Larry Osborne. He's our guest. I'm guessing that's your office. Is that the office at home or at church?
Oh, this is my office at home. My church one's about 10 by 10 like everybody else's. So.
I love it. This is where Larry Osborne's home in San Diego area. I'm Ed Stetzer, broadcasting here from the Send Institute office, actually at the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton, Illinois. Larry's written a whole bunch of books. You can find them if you just go to his Amazon page. Also, we list some of them at Exponential. Happy for you to do that. I do some church planting things, written a couple books, do the New Churches podcast, and some other things. If you're joining us, let me encourage you, share this with other people. If you're on Facebook Live, like and share. Otherwise, share the resource as well at the Exponential page. We'll be doing more of these in the weeks to come. So, Larry, to the questions. We've got a guy named Edward, which is a good name. I like that. We're on Team Edward. You'll only get that if you're a certain age. But the question is when you look at long-term goal of multiplication of churches, how do your key leaders fit into that vision? And the specific question here from Edward is it possible, and y'all's, I'm trying to read his question rather than I would say use guys, and y'all's opinion to have a bivocational pastor? And he asked y'all, so I'm going to weigh in on that after you do, but jump in.
I think it's totally possible to have a bivocational pastor. I think one of the great problems when I talked about the two rails of discipleship and leadership is we've turned vocational ministry into the top rung of a disciple. I'm asked all the time if my kids are in ministry, and I say, oh yeah. And they go, where do they serve? And I go, at North Coast Church. They go, what do they do? And I go, oh, one's a C-suite officer at a software firm. One does estimating for very large, $30 to $80 million government contracts, and one's a school teacher. And they look at me, what kind of church do you have? I go,
really big.
Yeah. And then I go, oh, I'm sorry, you meant vocational ministry. So I think one of the things that has really hindered the multiplication of the church is our sense that vocational ministry is the only real ministry, and everything else is double A. It's not. So on that one, I'm a big fan of vocational ministry. And I think we'd have a lot more multiplication if people saw themselves as on special assignment in the marketplace, and instead of just, I spend it all at the church.
Love that. Love that. I think you're right on. I think ultimately bivocational ministry is first of all, like your kids, they're in ministry because they're using their gifts. 1 Peter 4:10, as each has received a gift, use it to serve others. But there are also some who will be in ministry, bivocational, they're a pastor. There's some sort of pastoral role, deeply committed. Actually, we're doing a Send Institute think tank about that. Some of the folks at Exponential, Todd and Todd Wilson and Ralph Moore and some others will be there, because we're trying to think deeply, because every time there's a movement around the world, it involves bivocational or volunteer leaders. So we think that's a key thing, Edward. So if that's you, we're deeply thankful for you. I planted a church bivocationally. In my first church, I was a contractor and a planter. So thank you for the good work that you're doing.
Yeah, and I would say, I mentioned the spiritual gifts we preach on but don't really believe. We try to turn everybody into us. And the priesthood of belief. Someday I want to write a book on all the things we preach but don't believe. And another one of them is the priesthood of believers.
Yeah.
When the church in China lost the pros, it took off.
Yeah, he's talking about when the missionaries were expelled after Mao came to power, Chiang Kai-shek was exiled. So then what happens is the church, being then removed from foreign control in many, many cases, became an explosive force in China, for sure.
And even the professional pastors in China were then later on removed.
Yeah.
Right? So really, if you remove the laity, the church dies. If you remove the leadership, God somehow raises up new leadership.
Yeah, well, that sounds a little frightening for you and me, brother, but I do think that's true. So we want more, not less, bivocational. Let's go on to Brian's question. I want to try to get as many as we can. We only got a few more minutes. The inclination is to try and change culture from the pulpit. So that's a shift for many pastors and churches. What if the pastor desire for this shift, but the elder board does not? So how does the pastor work with the elder board? Because you mentioned your board earlier in the interview. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, I've got a whole book on that to put a plug in called Sticky Teams.
What's the book?
Sticky Teams.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And also Sticky Leaders talk about change and innovation. And part of the process is usually we're in too much of a hurry, and we want to make too much of a declaration. As I mentioned earlier, the way you change culture, if you're a church planner, you preach your culture and gather to yourself people who buy into it, and then you launch. But if you're a successor coming into an existing culture, you change it by changing what's done. And the first few times people go, we don't do it that way. Then they go, And after about 4 years, they go, we've always done it that way. Because culture is just simply a definition of how we do things around here. So one of the things I always tell people is figure out the most important boulders, not every rock. And then also, if you're working with a board and you have some resistance along the way, you ask to try things. Say you had a board that was very self-protective and it didn't want to have a kingdom mindset in the community. You could say, can we try this? Can we experiment with it? Rather than, here's a sermon series on the new initiative. Here's a white paper on the new initiative, which really does nothing more than arm your opponents with your game plan so it can be sabotaged. I have done much better on just simple, incremental little changes, or asking people for permission to try, and people who will not give you permission to change will gladly give you permission to try, because they love to stand back and watch the train wreck and say, I told you so.
Yeah, it's a good word. Okay, so we got a last question from Mike here. Now, because I like it, just came in. I apologize we couldn't get to all the questions. Lots of great questions and lots of good activity in the chat room. Thankful for you. Hopefully Facebook Live's been helpful as well. But Mike kind of asked, I'm going to modify his question a little bit. What he says, how I know many large churches are going multi-site, but are those multi-site campuses planning more churches, or are they simply waiting for the mother church to plant more campuses? So talk to me a little bit about, because I'm actually of the belief that one of the things happen in multi-site settings, it's replaced church planting in the mind of many churches, not yours, and not, for example, Dave Ferguson here, one of the things they do sites and a church plants, and he says based on the leader. How do you make sure that you're still engaged and care about church planting now that multi-site, well, you're one of the pioneers of it, has become a big thing?
Well, first of all, I think planting a multi-site church is planting a church.
Yep.
When I visit some of our campuses, and again, if you have just one primary teacher, you've got something that's going to fall apart if that teacher leaves. I'm a huge fan of team teaching, have been from when we were 200. And that's the only way you raise up and empower other teachers. So that's an important part of what we do because people know we use video. But when I show up, there's not this long line of people, oh, the bishop's here, or when Chris Brown, shows up, or Christopher Hilcom, the other two teachers. Their pastor is their pastor. And we're just communicating.
You're talking about the pastor at that site is their pastor.
The pastor at that site, yeah. He's the head of their staff. He's the one who's marrying. He's the one who's bearing. They very much see that as their church. And they just see us as a teaching function on a screen. So anytime you get more than, if a church grows 1,000 or so, you don't know all the people out there in front of you. You don't know their stories. You know the best and the worst. And those have been around a long time. So number one, I see multi-site as truly planting a church. It's a real church with real community impact. But then the other thing is, how do you stay focused on church planting? Is you bless those on your staff who feel like, I don't want to be a campus pastor because I feel like my communication gift is how I lead through that. And you help them find ways to plant. We've got a pastor right now, one of our key players, who wants to plant a church. He has a kind of strict parameter of what he's looking for. And it will probably be with another tribe, as we've done with others. We say, find the tribe you're most comfortable with, who will give you the most support and money. And we will still support you exactly the way we would if you were called the North Coast Church Plant. It's about the kingdom, not our tattoo. And so we're supporting him. And he told me the other day at lunch, he keeps running into friends of his and other pastors he talks to go, they know you're looking to leave? Yeah. Well, what are they doing? So they're supporting me wonderfully because he's got a great gift. Until he finds the place where God is calling him, we love having him around. And then we're going to send him off with balloons, a party, and support. And so to me, it's just a both and by asking the question, what kind of leaders do I have? Preaching leaders? They should plant a church. Just more group gathering leaders? They should have a site. And then one other thing I'd add, Ed, and that is we plan our multi-sites where we already have people. We are not looking at a map and saying, where does there need to be a church? I'd very much want to plant a church there. But when we have people who are driving more than 20 minutes, two things disappear. Come and see evangelism and youth involvement, both of which I believe are critical in this culture. And that's where we decide to do our sites. We look at our demographics and say, we don't high-five one another. We got a bunch of people coming 20 minutes or more. How cool are we? Our heart breaks because we know we can't reach the community. And so then we go, let's bring our church to them. See what happens.
Love it. Love it. Appreciate you. Again, you have been watching Backstage Live with the Exponential Conference and more. Larry Osborne's been our guest. He'll be one of the many hero makers speaking and equipping at our Exponential regional events this fall, along with Southern California, where Larry will be. Locations include Washington, D.C., Chicago, Houston, the Bay Area, and New York City. You get more information and register at exponential.org. Let me again, remind you, if you're watching by Facebook Live, like and share so others can hear from Larry and be encouraged along the way on their spiritual journey and their leadership journey as well. Larry, thanks for taking the time to join with us. As always, we're deeply thankful for you, for your ministry, and look forward to hearing from you in Southern California.
Great. I'm honored to be here. Thanks.
Good thing. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Again, this has been Exponential Backstage Live. Peace out. We'll see you next time. And I think we've got several shows coming up as well. So we'll have different speakers who are going to be there at Exponential as well. So stay tuned. It'll move around a little bit because we don't have a weekly time slot, but it'll give us the opportunity. You'll always be able to find these at the Facebook Live, at the Exponential site, and more. I'm Ed Stetzer here from the Ascend Institute. This has been Backstage Live with Exponential. Our guest, Larry Osborne. Peace out, everybody. Thanks for joining us.